Section 20. Moll Flanders. In the meantime, my poor distressed governess sent me a minister, who, at her request first, and at my own afterwards, came to visit me. He exhorted me seriously to repent of all my sins, and to dally no longer with my soul, not flattering myself with hopes of life, which he said he was informed there was no room to expect, but unfeignedly to look up to God with my whole soul, and to cry for pardon in the name of Jesus Christ. He backed his discourses with proper quotations of Scripture, encouraging the greatest sinner to repent and turn from their evil way, and when he had done, he kneeled down and prayed with me. It was now that for the first time I felt any real signs of repentance. I now began to look back upon my past life with abhorrence, and having a kind of view into the other side of time, and things of life, as I believe they do with everybody at such a time, began to look with a different aspect and quite another shape than they did before. The greatest and best things, the views of felicity, the joy, the griefs of life, were quite other things, and I had nothing in my thoughts but what was so infinitely superior to what I had known in life, that it appeared to me to be the greatest stupidity in nature to lay any weight upon anything, though the most valuable in this world. The word eternity represented itself with all its incomprehensible additions, and I had such extended notions of it that I know not how to express them. Among the rest, how vile, how gross, how absurd did every pleasant thing look! I mean that we had counted pleasant before, especially when I reflected that these sordid trifles were the things for which we forfeited eternal felicity. With these reflections came, of mere course, severe reproaches of my own mind for my wretched behaviour in my past life, that I had forfeited all hope of any happiness in the eternity that I was just going to enter into, and, on the contrary, was entitled to all that was miserable, or had been conceived of misery, and all this with the frightful addition of its being also eternal. I am not capable of reading lectures of instruction to anybody, but I relate this in the very manner in which things then appeared to me, as far as I am able, but infinitely short of the lively impression which they made on my soul at that time. Indeed, those impressions are not to be explained by words, or if they are, I am not mistress of words enough to express them. It must be the work of every sober reader to make just reflection on them, as their own circumstances may direct, and, without question, this is what every one at some time or other may feel something of, I mean, a clearer sight into things to come than they had here, and a dark view of their own concern in them. But I go back to my own case. The minister pressed me to tell him, as far as I thought convenient, in what state I found myself as to the sight I had of things beyond life. He told me that he did not come as ordinary of the place, whose business it is to extort confessions from prisoners, for private ends, or for the further detecting of other offenders. That his business was to move me to such freedom of discourse as might serve to disburthen my own mind, and furnish him to administer comfort to me as far as was in his power, and assured me that whatever I said to him should remain with him, and be as much a secret as if it was known only to God and myself, and that he desired to know nothing of me but as above, to qualify him to apply proper advice and assistance to me, and to pray to God for me. This honest, friendly way of treating me unlocked all the sluices of my passions. He broke into my very soul by it, and I unravelled all the wickedness of my life to him. In a word, I gave him an abridgment of this whole history. I gave him a picture of my conduct for 50 years in miniature. I hid nothing from him, and he, in return, exhorted me to sincere repentance, explained to me what he meant by repentance, and then drew out such a scheme of infinite mercy, proclaimed from heaven to sinners of the greatest magnitude, that he left me nothing to say that looked like despair or doubting of being accepted, and in this condition he left me the first night. He visited me again the next morning, and went on with his method of explaining the terms of divine mercy, which, according to him, consisted of nothing more or more difficult than that of being sincerely desirous of it and willing to accept it, only a sincere regret for and hatred of those things I had done, which rendered me so just an object of divine vengeance. I am not able to repeat the excellent discourses of this extraordinary man. 'Tis all I am able to do to say that he revived my heart, and brought me into such a condition that I never knew anything of in my life before. I was covered with shame and tears for things past, and yet had at the same time a secret surprising joy at the prospect of being a true penitent, and obtaining the comfort of a penitent, I mean the hope of being forgiven. And so swift did thoughts circulate, and so high did the impressions they had made upon me run, that I thought I could freely have gone out that minute to execution, without any uneasiness at all, casting my soul entirely into the arms of infinite mercy as a penitent. The good gentleman was so moved also in my behalf with a view of the influence which he saw these things had on me, that he blessed God he had come to visit me, and resolved not to leave me till the last moment, that is, not to leave visiting me. It was no less than 12 days after our receiving sentence before any were ordered for execution, and then upon a Wednesday the dead warrant, as they call it, came down, and I found my name was among them. A terrible blow this was to my new resolutions. Indeed, my heart sank within me, and I swooned away twice, one after another, but spoke not a word. The good minister was sorely afflicted for me, and did what he could to comfort me with the same arguments and the same moving eloquence that he did before, and left me not that evening so long as the prisoner-keepers would suffer him to stay in the prison, unless he would be locked up with me all night, which he was not willing to be. I wondered much that I did not see him all the next day, it being the day before the time appointed for execution, and I was greatly discouraged and dejected in my mind, and indeed almost sank for want of the comfort which he had so often and with such success yielded me on his former visits. I waited with great impatience, and under the greatest depression of spirits imaginable, till about 4 o'clock he came to my apartment, for I had obtained the favour, by the help of money, nothing being to be done in that place without it, not to be kept in the condemned hold, as they call it, among the rest of the prisoners who were to die, but to have a little dirty chamber to myself. My heart leapt within me for joy when I heard his voice at the door, even before I saw him, but let any one judge what kind of motion I found in my soul, when, after having made a short excuse for his not coming, he showed me that his time had been employed on my account, that he had obtained a favourable report from the Recorder to the Secretary of State in my particular case, and in short, that he had brought me a reprieve. He used all the caution that he was able in letting me know a thing which it would have been a double cruelty to have concealed, and yet it was too much for me. For as grief had overset me before, so did joy overset me now, and I fell into a much more dangerous swooning than I did at first, and it was not without a great difficulty that I was recovered at all. The good man, having made a very Christian exhortation to me not to let the joy of my reprieve put the remembrance of my past sorrow out of my mind, and having told me that he must leave me, to go and enter the reprieve in the books, and show it to the sheriffs, stood up just before his going away, and in a very earnest manner prayed to God for me, that my repentance might be made unfeigned and sincere, and that my coming back, as it were, into life again, might not be a returning to the follies of life which I had made such solemn resolutions to forsake, and to repent of them. I joined heartily in the petition, and must needs say I had deeper impressions upon my mind all that night of the mercy of God in sparing my life, and a greater detestation of my past sins, from a sense of the goodness which I had tasted in this case, than I had in all my sorrow before. This may be thought inconsistent in itself, and wide from the business of this book. Particularly I reflect that many of those who may be pleased and diverted with the relation of the wild and wicked part of my story may not relish this, which is really the best part of my life, the most advantageous to myself, and the most instructive to others. Such, however, will, I hope, allow me the liberty to make my story complete. It would be a severe satire on such to say they do not relish the repentance as much as they do the crime, and that they had rather the history were a complete tragedy, as it was very likely to have been. But I go on with my relation. The next morning there was a sad scene indeed in the prison. The first thing I was saluted with in the morning was the tolling of the great bell at St. Sepulchre's, as they call it, which ushered in the day. As soon as it began to toll, a dismal groaning and crying was heard from the condemned hole, where there lay 6 poor souls who were to be executed that day, some from one crime, some from another, and 2 of them for murder. This was followed by a confused clamour in the house among the several sorts of prisoners, expressing their awkward sorrows for the poor creatures that were to die, but in a manner extremely differing one from another. Some cried for them, some huzzaed and wished them a good journey, some damned and cursed those that had brought them to it, that is, meaning the evidence or prosecutors, many pitying them, and some few, but very few, praying for them. There was hardly room for so much composure of mind as was required to me to bless the merciful providence that had, as it were, snatched me out of the jaws of this destruction. I remained, as it were, dumb and silent, overcome with the sense of it, and not able to express what I had in my heart, for the passions on such occasions as these are certainly so agitated as not to be able presently to regulate their own motions. All the while the poor condemned creatures were preparing to their death, and the ordinary, as they call him, was busy with them, disposing them to submit to their sentence. I say, all this while I was seized with a fit of trembling, as much as I could have been if I had been in the same condition as to be sure the day before I expected to be. I was so violently agitated by this surprising fit that I shook as if I had been in the cold fit of an ague, so that I could not speak or look but like one distracted. As soon as they were all put into carts and gone, which, however, I had not courage enough to see, I say, as soon as they were gone, I fell into a fit of crying involuntarily, and without design, but as a mere distemper, and yet so violent, and it held me so long, that I knew not what course to take, nor could I stop or put a check to it, no, not with all the strength and courage I had. This fit of crying held me near 2 hours, and, as I believe, held me till they were all out of the world, and then a most humble, penitent, serious kind of joy succeeded. A real transport it was, or passion of joy and thankfulness, but still unable to give vent to it by words, and in this I continued most part of the day. In the evening the good minister visited me again, and then fell to his usual good discourses. He congratulated my having a space yet allowed me for repentance, whereas the state of those 6 poor creatures was determined, and they were now past the offers of salvation. He earnestly pressed me to retain the same sentiments of the things of life that I had when I had a view of eternity, and at the end of all told me I should not conclude that all was over, that a reprieve was not a pardon, that he could not yet answer for the effects of it. However, I had this mercy, that I had more time given me, and that it was my business to improve that time. This discourse, though very seasonable, left a kind of sadness on my heart, as if I might expect the affair would have a tragical issue still, which, however, he had no certainty of, and I did not indeed at that time question him about it, he having said that he would do his utmost to bring it to a good end, and that he hoped he might, but he would not have me be secure, and the consequence proved that he had reason for what he said. It was about a fortnight after this that I had some just apprehensions that I should be included in the next dead warrant at the ensuing sessions, and it was not without great difficulty, and at last a humble petition for transportation, that I avoided it, so ill was I beholding to fame, and so prevailing was the fatal report of being an old offender, though in that they did not do me strict justice, for I was not in the sense of the law an old offender, whatever I was in the eye of the judge, for I had never been before them in a judicial way before. So the judges could not charge me with being an old offender, but the recorder was pleased to represent my case as he thought fit. I had now a certainty of life indeed, but with the hard conditions of being ordered for transportation, which indeed was hard condition in itself, but not when comparatively considered, and therefore I shall make no comments upon the sentence, nor upon the choice I was put to. We shall all choose anything rather than death, especially when 'tis attended with an uncomfortable prospect beyond it, which was my case. The good minister, whose interest, though a stranger to me, had obtained me the reprieve, mourned sincerely for this part. He was in hope, he said, that I should have ended my days under the influence of good instruction, that I should not have been turned loose again among such a wretched crew as they generally are, who are thus sent abroad, where, as he said, I must have more than ordinary secret assistance from the grace of God, if I did not turn as wicked again as ever. I have not for a good while mentioned my governess, who had, during most, if not all, of this part, been dangerously sick, and being in as near a view of death by her disease as I was by my sentence, was a great penitent. I say I have not mentioned her, nor indeed did I see her in all this time, but being now recovering, and just able to come abroad, she came to see me. I told her my condition, and what a different flux and reflux of tears and hopes I had been agitated with. I told her what I had escaped, and upon what terms, and she was present when the minister expressed his fears of my relapsing into wickedness upon my falling into the wretched companies that are generally transported. Indeed, I had a melancholy reflection upon it in my own mind, for I knew what a dreadful gang was always sent away together, and I said to my governess that the good minister's fears were not without cause. "Well, well," says she, "but I hope you will not be tempted with such a horrid example as that." And as soon as the minister was gone, she told me she would not have me discouraged, for perhaps ways and means might be found out to dispose of me in a particular way, by myself, of which she would talk further to me afterward. I looked earnestly at her, and I thought she looked more cheerful than she usually had done, and I entertained immediately 1,000 notions of being delivered, but could not for my life imagine the methods, or think of one that was in the least feasible. But I was too much concerned in it to let her go from me without explaining herself, which though she was very loath to do, yet my importunity prevailed, and while I was still pressing, she answered me in a few words thus: "Why, you have money, have you not? Did you ever know one in your life that was transported and had £100 in his pocket? I'll warrant you, child," says she. I understood her presently, but told her I would leave all that to her. But I saw no room to hope for anything but a strict execution of the order, and as it was a severity that was esteemed a mercy, there was no doubt but it would be strictly observed. She said no more but this: "We will try what can be done." And so we parted for that night. I lay in the prison near 15 weeks after this order for transportation was signed. What the reason of it was I know not, but at the end of this time I was put on board a ship in the Thames, and with me a gang of 13 as hard and vile creatures as ever Newgate produced in my time, and it would really well take up a history longer than mine to describe the degrees of impudence and audacious villainy that those 13 were arrived to, and the manner of their behaviour in the voyage, of which I have a very diverting account by me, which the captain of the ship who carried them over gave me the minutes of, and which he caused his mate to write down at large. It may perhaps be thought trifling to enter here into a relation of all the little incidents which attended me in this interval of my circumstances. I mean, between the final order of my transportation and the time of my going on board the ship. And I am too near the end of my story to allow room for it. But something relating to me and my Lancashire husband I must not omit. He had, as I have observed already, been carried from the master's side of the ordinary prison into the press yard with 3 of his comrades, for they found another to add to them after some time. Here, for what reason I knew not, they were kept in custody without being brought to trial almost 3 months. It seems they found means to bribe or buy off some of those who were expected to come in against them, and they wanted evidence for some time to convict them. After some puzzle on this account, at first they made a shift to get proof enough against 2 of them to carry them off, but the other 2, of which my Lancashire husband was one, lay still in suspense. They had, I think, 1 positive evidence against each of them, but the law strictly obliging them to have 2 witnesses, they could make nothing of it. Yet it seems they were resolved not to part with the men neither, not doubting but a further evidence would at last come in, and in order to this, I think, publication was made, that such prisoners being taken, any one that had been robbed by them might come to the prison and see them. I took this opportunity to satisfy my curiosity, pretending that I had been robbed in the Dunstable coach, and that I would go to see the 2 highwaymen. But when I came into the press yard, I so disguised myself and muffled my face up so that he could see little of me, and consequently knew nothing of who I was, and when I came back I said publicly that I knew them very well. Immediately it was rumoured all over the prison that Moll Flanders would turn evidence against one of the highwaymen, and that I was to come off by it from the sentence of transportation. They heard of it, and immediately my husband desired to see this Mrs. Flanders that knew him so well, and was to be in evidence against him, and accordingly I had leave given to go to him. I dressed myself up as well as the best clothes that I suffered myself ever to appear in there would allow me, and went to the press yard, but had for some time a hood over my face. He said little to me at first, but asked me if I knew him. I told him yes, very well, but as I concealed my face, so I counterfeited my voice, that he had not the least guess at who I was. He asked me where I had seen him. I told him between Dunstable and Brick Hill, but turning to the keeper that stood by, I asked if I might not be admitted to talk with him alone. He said yes, yes, as much as I pleased, and so very civilly withdrew. As soon as he was gone, I had shut the door. I threw off my hood, and bursting out into tears, "My dear," says I, "do you not know me?" He turned pale, and stood speechless, like one thunderstruck, and not able to conquer the surprise, said no more but this, "Let me sit down." And sitting down by a table, he laid his elbow upon the table, and leaning his hand on his head, fixed his eyes on the ground as one stupid. I cried so vehemently on the other hand that it was a good while ere I could speak any more, but after I had given some vent to my passion by tears, I repeated the same words, "My dear, do you not know me?" At which he answered, "Yes," and said no more a good while. After some time continuing in the surprise as above, he cast up his eyes towards me and said, "How could you be so cruel?" I did not readily understand what he meant, and I answered, "How can you call me cruel? What have I been cruel to you in?" "To come to me," says he, "in such a place as this, is it not to insult me? I have not robbed you, at least not on the highway." I perceived by this that he knew nothing of the miserable circumstances I was in, and thought that, having got some intelligence of his being there, I had come to upbraid him with his leaving me. But I had too much to say to him to be affronted, and told him in few words that I was far from coming to insult him, but at best I came to condole mutually, that he would be easily satisfied that I had no such view when I should tell him that my condition was worse than his, and that many ways. He looked a little concerned at the general expression of my condition being worse than his, but, with a kind smile, looked a little wildly, and said, "How can that be, when you see me fettered and in Newgate, and two of my companions executed already? How can your condition be worse than mine?" "Come, my dear," says I, "we have a long piece of work to do if I should be to relate, or you to hear, my unfortunate history. But if you are disposed to hear it, you will soon conclude with me that my condition is worse than yours." "How is that possible," says he again, "when I expect to be cast for my life the very next sessions?" "Yes," says I, "'tis very possible, when I shall tell you that I have been cast for my life 3 sessions ago, and am under sentence of death. Is not my case worse than yours?" Then indeed he stood silent again, like one struck dumb, and after a while he starts up. "Unhappy couple," says he, "how can this be possible?" I took him by the hand. "Come, my dear," said I, "sit down, and let us compass our sorrows. I am a prisoner in this very house, and in much worse circumstances than you, and you will be satisfied I do not come to insult you when I tell you the particulars." And with this we sat down together, and I told him so much of my story as I thought was convenient, bringing it at last to my being reduced to great poverty, and representing myself as fallen into some company that led me to relieve my distress by way that I had been utterly unacquainted with, and that they, making an attempt at a tradesman's house, I was seized upon for having been but just at the door, the maidservant pulling me in, that I neither had broke any lock nor taken anything away, and that, notwithstanding that, I was brought in guilty and sentenced to die, but that the judges, having been made sensible of the hardship of my circumstances, had obtained leave to remit the sentence upon my consenting to be transported. I told him I fared the worse for being taken in the prison for one Moll Flanders, who was a famous successful thief that all of them had heard of, but none of them had ever seen, but that, as he knew well, was none of my name. But I placed all to the account of my ill fortune, and that under this name I was dealt with as an old offender, though this was the first thing they had ever known of me. I gave him a long particular of things that had befallen me since I saw him, But I told him if I had seen him since he might think I had, and then gave him an account how I had seen him at Brickhill, how furiously he was pursued, and how, by giving an account that I knew him, and that he was a very honest gentleman, one Mr. Blank, the hue and cry was stopped, and the High Constable went back again. He listened most attentively to all my story, and smiled at most of the particulars, being all of them petty matters, and infinitely below what he had been at the head of. But when I came to the story of Brickhill, he was surprised. "And it was you, my dear," said he, "that gave the cheque to the mob that was at our heels there at Brickhill." "Yes," said I, "it was I, indeed." And then I told him the particulars which I had observed him there. "Why then," said he, "it was you that saved my life at that time, and I am glad I owe my life to you, for I will pay the debt to you now, and I'll deliver you from the present condition you are in, or I will die in the attempt." I told him by no means. It was a risk too great, not worth his running the hazard of, and for a life not worth his saving. "'Twas no matter for that," he said. "It was a life worth all the world to him, a life that had given him a new life. For," says he, "I was never in real danger of being taken, but that time till the last minute when I was taken." Indeed, he told me his danger then lay in his believing he had not been pursued that way, for they had gone off from Hockey quite another way, and had come over the enclosed country into Brickhill, not by the road, and was sure they had not been seen by anybody. Here he gave me a long history of his life, which indeed would make a very strange history, and be infinitely diverting. He told me he took to the road about 12 years before he married me, that the woman which called him brother was not really his sister or any kin to him, but one that belonged to their gang, and who, keeping correspondence with him, lived always in town, having good store of acquaintance; that she gave them a perfect intelligence of persons going out of town, and that they had made several good booties by her correspondence; that she thought she had fixed a fortune for him when she brought him to me, but happened to be disappointed, which he really could not blame her for; that if it had been his good luck that I had had the estate, which he was informed I had, he had resolved to leave off the road and live a retired, sober life, but never to appear in public till some general pardon had been passed, or till he could, for money, have got his name into some particular pardon, so that he might have been perfectly easy; but that, as it had proved otherwise, he was obliged to put off his equipage and take up the old trade again. He gave me a long account of some of his adventures, and particularly one when he robbed the Westchester coaches near Lichfield, when he got a very great booty, and after that how he robbed 5 graziers in the west, going to Burford Fair in Wiltshire to buy sheep. He told me he got so much money on those 2 occasions that if he had known where to have found me, he would certainly have embraced my proposal of going with me to Virginia, or to have settled in a plantation on some other parts of the English colonies in America. He told me he wrote 2 or 3 letters to me, directed according to my order, but heard nothing from me. This I indeed knew to be true, but the letters coming to my hand in the time of my latter husband, I could do nothing in it, and therefore chose to give no answer, that so he might rather believe they had miscarried. Being thus disappointed, he said, he carried on the old trade ever since, though when he had gotten so much money, he said, he did not run such desperate risks as he did before. Then he gave me some account of several hard and desperate encounters which he had with gentlemen on the road, who parted too hardly with their money, and showed me some wounds he had received. And he had 1 or 2 very terrible wounds indeed, as particularly one by a pistol bullet which broke his arm, and another with a sword which ran him quite through the body, but that missing his vitals he was cured again. One of his comrades having kept by him so faithfully and so friendly as that he assisted him in riding near 80 miles before his arm was set, and then got a surgeon in a considerable city, remote from that place where it was done, pretending they were gentlemen travelling towards Carlisle, and that they had been attacked on the road by highwaymen, and that one of them had shot him into the arm and broke the bone. This, he said, his friend managed so well that they were not suspected at all, but lay still till he was perfectly cured. He gave me so many distinct accounts of his adventures that it was with great reluctance that I declined the relating them, but I consider that this is my story, not his. I then inquired into the circumstances of his present case at that time, and what it was he expected when he came to be tried. He told me that they had no evidence against him, or but very little, for that of the 3 robberies which they were all charged with, it was his good fortune that he was but in one of them, and that there was but 1 witness to be had for that fact, which was not sufficient, but that it was expected some others would come in against him. that he thought indeed when he first saw me that I had been one that came of that errand, but that if somebody came in against him he hoped he should be cleared, that he had some intimation that if he would submit to transport himself he might be admitted to it without a trial, but that he could not think of it with any temper, and thought he could much easier submit to be hanged. I blamed him for that, and told him I blamed him on 2 accounts. First, because if he was transported, there might be 100 ways for him that was a gentleman and a bold, enterprising man to find his way back again, and perhaps some ways and means to come back before he went. He smiled at that part, and said he should like the last the best of the 2, for he had a kind of horror upon his mind at his being sent over to the plantations, as Romans sent condemned slaves to work in the mines, that he thought the passage into another state, let it be what it would, much more tolerable at the gallows, and that this was the general notion of all the gentlemen who were driven by the exigence of their fortunes to take the road, that at the place of execution there was at least an end of all the miseries of the present state, and as for what was to follow, a man was, in his opinion, as likely to repent sincerely in the last fortnight of his life under the pressures and agonies of a jail and the condemned hole as he would ever be in the woods and wilderness of America, that servitude and hard labour were things gentlemen could never stoop to, that it was but the way to force them to be their own executioners afterwards, which was much worse, and that therefore he could not have any patience when he did but think of being transported. I used the utmost of my endeavour to persuade him, and joined that known woman's rhetoric to it, I mean that of tears. I told him the infamy of a public execution was certainly a greater pressure upon the spirits of a gentleman than any of the mortifications that he could meet with abroad could be, that he had at least in the other a chance for his life, whereas here he had none at all, that it was the easiest thing in the world for him to manage the captain of a ship, who were generally speaking men of good humour and some gallantry, and a small matter of conduct, especially if there was any money to be had, would make way for him to buy himself off when he came to Virginia. He looked wistfully at me, and I thought I guessed at what he meant, that is to say, that he had no money. But I was mistaken. His meaning was another way. "You hinted just now, my dear," said he, "that there might be a way of coming back before I went, by which I understood you that it might be possible to buy it off here. I had rather give £200 to prevent going than £100 to be set at liberty when I came there." "That is, my dear," said I, "because you do not know the place so well as I do." "That may be," said he, "and yet I believe, as well as you know it, you would do the same, unless it is because, as you told me, you have a mother there." I told him, as to my mother, it was next to impossible, but that she must be dead many years before, and as for any other relations that I might have there, I knew them not now, that since the misfortunes I had been under had reduced me to the condition I had been in for some years, I had not kept up any correspondence with them, and that he would easily believe I should find but a cold reception from them if I should be put to make my first visit in the condition of a transported felon. That therefore, if I went thither, I resolved not to see them, but that I had many views in going there, if it should be my fate, which took off all the uneasy part of it. And if he found himself obliged to go also, I should easily instruct him how to manage himself so as never to go a servant at all, especially since I found he was not destitute of money, which was the only friend in such a condition. He smiled, and said he did not tell me he had money. I took him up short, and told him I hoped he did not understand by my speaking that I should expect any supply from him if he had money, that, on the other hand, though I had not a great deal, yet I did not want, and while I had any, I would rather add to him than weaken him in that article, seeing whatever he had, I knew in the case of transportation he would have occasion of it all. He expressed himself in a most tender manner upon that head. He told me what money he had was not a great deal, but that he would never hide any of it from me if I wanted it, and that he assured me he did not speak with any such apprehensions, that he was only intent upon what I had hinted to him before he went, that here he knew what to do with himself, but that there he should be the most ignorant, helpless wretch alive. I told him he frighted and terrified himself with that which had no terror in it, that if he had money, as I was glad to hear he had, he might not only avoid the servitude supposed to be the consequence of transportation, but begin the world upon a new foundation, and that such a one as he could not fail of success in with the common application usual in such cases. that he could not but call to mind that it was what I had recommended to him many years before, and had proposed it for our mutual subsistence and restoring our fortunes in the world. And I would tell him now that to convince him both of the certainty of it and of my being fully acquainted with the method, and also fully satisfied in the probability of success, he should first see me deliver myself from the necessity of going over at all, and then that I would go with him freely and of my own choice, and perhaps carry enough with me to satisfy him that I did not offer it for want of being able to live without assistance from him, but that I thought our mutual misfortunes had been such as were sufficient to reconcile us both to quitting this part of the world, and living where nobody could upbraid us with what was past, or we be in any dread of a prison, and without agonies of a condemned hole to drive us to it. This, where we should look back on all our past disasters with infinite satisfaction, when we should consider that our enemies should entirely forget us, and that we should live as new people in a new world, nobody having anything to say to us, or we to them. I pressed this home to him with so many arguments, and answered all his own passionate objections so effectually, that he embraced me, and told me I treated him with such sincerity and affection as overcame him, that he would take my advice, and would strive to submit to his fate, in hope of having the comfort of my assistance, and of so faithful a counsellor and such a companion in his misery. But still he put me in mind of what I had mentioned before, namely, that there might be some way to get off before he went, and that it might be possible to avoid going at all, which he said would be much better. I told him he should see, and be fully satisfied, that I would do my utmost in that part too, and if it did not succeed, yet that I would make good the rest. We parted after this long conference with such testimonies of kindness and affection as I thought were equal, if not superior, to that of our parting at Dunstable. And now I saw more plainly than before the reasons why he declined coming at that time any farther with me towards London than Dunstable, and why, when we parted there, he told me it was not convenient for him to come part of the way to London to bring me going, as he would otherwise have done. I have observed that the account of his life would have made a much more pleasing history than this of mine, and indeed nothing in it was more strange than this part, viz., that he carried on that desperate trade full 25 years, and had never been taken. The success he had met with had been so very uncommon, and such that sometimes he had lived handsomely, and retired in place for a year or two at a time, keeping himself and a manservant to wait on him, and had often sat in the coffee-houses and heard the very people whom he had robbed give accounts of their being robbed, and of the place and circumstances, so that he could easily remember that it was the same. In this manner, it seems, he lived near Liverpool at the time he unluckily married me for a fortune. Had I been the fortune he expected, I verily believe, as he said, that he would have taken up and lived honestly all his days. He had, with the rest of his misfortunes, the good luck not to be actually upon the spot when the robbery was done which he was committed for, and so none of the persons robbed could swear to him, or had anything to charge upon him. But it seems, as he was taken with the gang, one hard-mouthed countryman swore home to him, and they were like to have others come in according to the publication they had made, so that they expected more evidence against him, and for that reason he was kept in hold. However, the offer which was made to him of admitting him to transportation was made, as I understood, upon the intercession of some great person, who pressed him hard to accept it before a trial. And indeed, as he knew there were several that might come in against him, I thought his friend was in the right, and I lay at him night and day to delay it no longer. At last, with much difficulty, he gave his consent, and as he was not therefore admitted to transportation in court, and on his petition, as I was, so he found himself under a difficulty to avoid embarking himself as I had said he might have done, his great friend, who was his intercessor for the favour of that grant, having given security for him that he should transport himself and not return within the term. This hardship broke all my measures, for the steps I took afterwards for my own deliverance were hereby rendered wholly ineffectual, unless I would abandon him, and leave him to go to America by himself, than which he protested he would much rather venture, although he was certain to go directly to the gallows. I must now return to my case. The time of my being transported, according to my sentence, was near at hand. My governess, who continued my fast friend, had tried to obtain a pardon, but it could not be done, unless with an expense too heavy for my purse, considering that to be left naked and empty, unless I had resolved to return to my old trade again, had been worse than my transportation, because there I knew I could live, here I could not. The good minister stood very hard on another account to prevent my being transported also, but he was answered that indeed my life had been given me at his first solicitations, and therefore he ought to ask no more. He was sensibly grieved at my going, because, as he said, he feared I should lose the good impressions which a prospect of death had at first made on me, and which were since increased by his instructions, and the pious gentleman was exceedingly concerned about me on that account. On the other hand, I really was not so solicitous about it as I was before, but I industriously concealed my reasons for it from the minister, and to the last he did not know but that I went with the utmost reluctance and affliction. It was in the month of February that I was, with 7 other convicts, as they called us, delivered to a merchant that traded to Virginia, on board a ship, riding, as they called it, in Deptford Reach. The officer of the prison delivered us on board, and the master of the vessel gave a discharge for us. We were that night clapped under hatches, and kept so close that I thought I should have been suffocated for want of air, and the next morning the ship weighed, and fell down the river to a place they called Bugby's Hole, which was done, as they told us, by the agreement of the merchant, that all opportunity of escape should be taken from us. However, when the ship came thither and cast anchor, we were allowed more liberty, and particularly were permitted to come up on the deck, but not up on the quarter-deck, that being kept particularly for the captain and for passengers. When by the noise of the men over my head and the motion of the ship I perceived that they were under sail, I was at first greatly surprised, fearing we should go away directly, and that our friends would not be admitted to see us any more. But I was easy soon after, when I found they had come to an anchor again, and soon after that we had notice given by some of the men where we were, that the next morning we should have the liberty to come up on deck, and to have our friends come and see us, if we had any. All that night I lay upon the hard boards of the deck, as the passengers did, but we had afterwards the liberty of little cabins for such of us as had any bedding to lay in them, and room to stow any box or trunk for clothes and linen, if we had it, which might well be put in, for some of them had neither shirt nor shift, or a rag of linen or woolen, but what was on their backs, or a farthing of money to help themselves. And yet I did not find but they fared well enough in the ship, especially the women, who got money from the seamen for washing their clothes, sufficient to purchase any common things that they wanted. When the next morning we had the liberty to come up on the deck, I asked one of the officers of the ship whether I might not have the liberty to send a letter on shore, to let my friends know where the ship lay, and to get some necessary things sent to me. This was, it seems, the boatswain, a very civil, courteous sort of man, who told me that I should have that or any other liberty that I desired, that he could allow me with safety. I told him I desired no other, and he answered that the ship's boat would go up to London the next tide, and he would order my letter to be carried. Accordingly, when the boat went off, the boatswain came to me and told me the boat was going off, and that he went in it himself, and asked me if my letter was ready, he would take care of it. I had prepared myself, you may be sure, pen, ink, and paper beforehand, and I had gotten a letter ready, directed to my governess, and enclosed another for my fellow prisoner, which, however, I did not let her know was my husband, not to the last. In that to my governess I let her know where the ship lay, and pressed her earnestly to send me what things I knew she had got ready for me for my voyage. When I gave the boatswain the letter, I gave him a shilling with it, which I told him was for the charge of a messenger or porter, which I entreated him to send with the letter as soon as he came on shore, that if possible I might have an answer brought back by the same hand, that I might know what was become of my things. For, sir, says I, if the ship should go away before I have them on board, I am undone. I took care, when I gave him the shilling, to let him see that I had a little better furniture about me than the ordinary prisoners, for he saw that I had a purse, and in it a pretty deal of money, and I found that the very sight of it immediately furnished me with very different treatment from what I should otherwise have met with in the ship, for though he was very courteous indeed before, in a kind of natural compassion to me, as a woman in distress, yet he was more than ordinarily so afterwards, and procured me to be better treated in the ship than, I say, I might otherwise have been, as shall appear in its place. He very honestly had my letter delivered to my governess's own hands, and brought me back an answer from her in writing, and when he gave me the answer, gave me the shilling again. "There," says he, "there's your shilling again, too, for I delivered the letter myself." I could not tell what to say, I was so surprised at the thing, but after some pause I said, "Sir, you are too kind. It had been but reasonable that you had paid yourself coach hire then." "No, no," says he, "I am overpaid. What is the gentlewoman? Your sister?" "No, sir," says I, "she is no relation to me, but she is a dear friend, and all the friends I have in the world." "Well," says he, "there are few such friends in the world. Why, she cried after you like a child." "Aye," says I again, "she would give £100, I believe, to deliver me from this dreadful condition I am in." "Would she so?" says he. "For half the money I believe I could put you in a way how to deliver yourself." But this he spoke softly, that nobody could hear. "Alas, sir," said I, "but then that must be such a deliverance as, if I should be taken again, would cost me my life." "Nay," said he, "if you are once out of the ship, you must look to yourself afterwards. That I can say nothing to." So we dropped the discourse for that time. In the meantime my governess, faithful to the last moment, conveyed my letter to the prison to my husband, and got an answer to it, and the next day came down herself to the ship, bringing me, in the first place, a sea-bed, as they call it, and all its furniture, such as was convenient, but not to let the people think it was extraordinary. She brought with her a sea-chest, that is, a chest such as are made for seamen, with all the conveniences in it, and filled with everything almost that I could want. And in one of the corners of the chest, where there was a private drawer, was my bank of money. This is to say, so much of it as I had resolved to carry with me, for I ordered a part of my stock to be left behind me, to be sent afterwards in such goods as I should want when I came to settle, for money in that country is not of much use, for all things are bought for tobacco, much more is it a great loss to carry it from hence. But my case was particular. It was by no means proper to me to go thither without money or goods, and for a poor convict that was to be sold as soon as I came on shore, to carry with me a cargo of goods would be to have notice taken of it, and perhaps to have them seized by the public. So I took part of my stock with me thus, and left the other part with my governess. My governess brought me a great many other things, but it was not proper for me to look too well provided in the ship, at least till I knew what kind of captain we should have. When she came into the ship, I thought she would have died, indeed. Her heart sank at the sight of me, and at the thoughts of parting with me in that condition, and she cried so intolerably I could not for a long time have any talk with her. I took that time to read my fellow prisoner's letter, which, however, greatly perplexed me. He told me he was determined to go, but found it would be impossible for him to be discharged time enough for going in the same ship, and which was more than all, he began to question whether they would give him leave to go in what ship he pleased, though he did voluntarily transport himself, but that they would see him put on board such a ship as they should direct, and that he would be charged upon the captain as other convict prisoners were, so that he began to be in despair of seeing me till he came to Virginia, which made him almost desperate. Seeing that, on the other hand, if I should not be there, if any accident of the sea or of mortality should take me away, he should be the most undone creature there in the world. This was very perplexing, and I knew not what course to take. I told my governess the story of the boatswain, and she was mighty eager with me treat with him, but I had no mind to it till I heard whether my husband, or fellow prisoner, so she called him, could be at liberty to go with me or no. At last I was forced to let her into the whole matter, except only that of his being my husband. I told her I had made a positive bargain or agreement with him to go, if he could get the liberty of going in the same ship, and that I found he had money. Then I read a long lecture to her of what I proposed to do when we came there, how we could plant, settle, and in short grow rich without any more adventures, and as a great secret I told her that we were to marry as soon as he came on board. She soon agreed cheerfully to my going when she heard this, and she made it her business from that time to get him out of the prison in time, so that he might go in the same ship with me, which at last was brought to pass, though with great difficulty, and not without all the forms of a transported prisoner-convict, which he really was not yet, for he had not been tried, and which was a great mortification to him. As our fate was now determined, and we were both on board, actually bound to Virginia, in the despicable quality of transported convicts destined to be sold for slaves, I for 5 years, and he under bonds and security not to return to England any more as long as he lived, he was very much dejected and cast down. The mortification of being brought on board as he was like a prisoner piqued him very much, since it was first told him he should transport himself, and so that he might go as a gentleman at liberty. It is true he was not ordered to be sold when he came there, as we were, and for that reason he was obliged to pay for his passage to the captain, which we were not. As for the rest, he was as much at a loss as a child what to do with himself, or with what he had, but by directions. Our first business was to compare our stock. He was very honest with me, and told me his stock was pretty good when he came into the prison, but that living there as he did in a figure like a gentleman, and which was 10 times as much the making of friends and soliciting his case, had been very expensive, and in a word, all his stock that he had left was £108, which he had about him all in gold. I gave him an account of my stock as faithfully, that is to say, of what I had taken to carry with me, for I was resolved, whatever should happen, to keep what I had left with my governess in reserve, that in case I should die, what I had with me was enough to give him, and that which was left in my governess's hands would be her own, which she had well deserved of me indeed. My stock, which I had with me, was £246, some odd shillings, so that we had £354 between us, but a worse gotten estate was scarce ever put together to begin the world with. Our greatest misfortune as to our stock was that it was all in money, which every one knows is an unprofitable cargo to be carried to the plantations. I believe his was really all he had left in the world, as he told me it was, but I, who had between £700 and £800 in bank when this disaster befell me, and who had one of the faithfulest friends in the world to manage it for me, considering she was a woman of manner of religious principles, had still £300 left in her hand, which I reserved as above. Besides some very valuable things, as particularly 2 gold watches, some small pieces of plate, and some rings, all stolen goods. The plate, rings, and watches were put in my chest with the money, and with this fortune, and in the 61st year of my age, I launched out into a new world, as I may call it, in the condition, as to what appeared, only of a poor naked convict ordered to be transported in respite from the gallows. My clothes were poor and mean, but not ragged or dirty, and none knew in the whole ship that I had anything of value about me. However, as I had a great many very good clothes and linen in abundance, which I had ordered to be packed up in 2 great boxes, I had them shipped on board, not as my goods, but as consigned to my real name in Virginia, and had the bills of loading signed by a captain in my pocket. And in these boxes was my plate and watches, and everything of value except my money, which I kept by itself in a private drawer in my chest, which could not be found or opened, if found, without splitting the chest to pieces. In this condition I lay for 3 weeks in the ship, not knowing whether I should have my husband with me or no, and therefore not resolving how or in what manner to receive the honest boatswain's proposal, which indeed he thought a little strange at first. At the end of this time, behold, my husband came on board. He looked with a dejected, angry countenance. His great heart was swelled with rage and disdain to be dragged along with 3 keepers of Newgate and put on board like a convict when he had not so much as been brought to a trial. He made loud complaint of it by his friends, for it seems he had some interest, but his friends got some check in their application, and were told he had had favour enough, and that they had received such an account of him since the last grant of his transportation, that he ought to think himself very well treated that he was not prosecuted anew. This answer quieted him at once, for he knew too much what might have happened, and what he had room to expect. And now he saw the goodness of the advice to him, which prevailed with him to accept of the offer of a voluntary transportation. And after this his chagrin at these hell-hounds, as he called them, was a little over. He looked a little composed, began to be cheerful, and as I was telling him how glad I was to have him once more out of their hands, he took me in his arms, and acknowledged with great tenderness that I had given him the best advice possible. "My dear," says he, "thou hast twice saved my life. From henceforth it shall be all employed for you, and I'll always take your advice." The ship began now to fill. Several passengers came on board who were embarked on no criminal account, and these had accommodations assigned them in the great cabin and other parts of the ship, whereas we, as convicts, were thrust down below, I know not where. But when my husband came on board, I spoke to the boatswain, who had so early given me hints of his friendship in carrying my letter. I told him he had befriended me in many ways, and I had not made any suitable return to him, and with that I put a guinea into his hand. I told him that my husband was now come on board, that though we were both under the present misfortune, yet we had been persons of a different character from the wretched crew that we came with, and desired to know of him whether the captain might not be moved to admit us to some conveniences in the ship, for which we would make him what satisfaction he pleased, and that we would gratify him for his pains in procuring this for us. He took the guinea, as I could see, with great satisfaction, and assured me of his assistance. Then he told us he did not doubt but that the captain, who was one of the best-humoured gentlemen in the world, would be easily brought to accommodate us as well as we could desire, and, to make me easy, told me he would go up the next tide on purpose to speak to the captain about it. The next morning, happening to sleep a little longer than ordinary, when I got up and began to look abroad, I saw the boatswain among the men in his ordinary business. I was a little melancholy at seeing him there, and going forward to speak to him, he saw me and came towards me, but not giving him time to speak first, I said, smiling, "I doubt, sir, you have forgot us, for I see you are very busy." He returned presently. "Come along with me, and you shall see." So he took me into the great cabin, and there sat a good sort of a gentlemanly man of a seaman, writing, and with a great many papers before him. "Here," says the boatswain to him that was a-writing, "is the gentlewoman that the captain spoke to you of." And turning to me, he said, "I have been so far from forgetting your business that I have been up at the captain's house, and I have represented faithfully to the captain what you said, relating to you being furnished with better conveniences for yourself and your husband. And the captain has sent this gentleman, who is mate of the ship, down with me, on purpose to show you everything, and to accommodate you fully to your content, and bid me assure you that you shall not be treated like what you were at first expected to be, but with the same respect as other passengers are treated." The mate then spoke to me, and not giving me time to thank the boatswain for his kindness, confirmed what the boatswain had said, and added that it was the captain's delight to show himself kind and charitable, especially to those that were under any misfortune. And with that he showed me several cabins built up, some in the great cabin, and some partitioned off out of the steerage, but opening into the great cabin on purpose for the accommodation of passengers, and gave me leave to choose where I would. However, I chose a cabin which opened into the steerage, in which was very good convenience to set our chest and boxes, and a table to eat on. The mate then told me that the boatswain had given so good a character of me and my husband as to our civil behaviour, that he had orders to tell me we should eat with him, if we thought fit, during the whole voyage, on the common terms of passengers, that we might lay in some fresh provisions if we pleased, or if not, he should lay in his usual store, and we should have share with him. This was very reviving news to me, after so many hardships and afflictions as I had gone through of late. I thanked him, and told him the captain should make his own terms with us, and asked him leave to go and tell my husband of it, who was not very well, and was not yet out of his cabin. Accordingly I went, and my husband, whose spirits were still so much sunk with the indignity, as he understood it, offered him, that he was scared yet himself, was so revived with the account that I gave him of the reception we were like to have in the ship, that he was quite another man, and new vigour and courage appeared in his very countenance. So true is it that the greatest of spirits, when overwhelmed by their afflictions, are subject to the greatest dejections, and are the most apt to despair and give themselves up. After some little pause to recover himself, my husband came up with me, and gave the mate thanks for the kindness which he had expressed to us, and sent suitable acknowledgment by him to the captain, offering to pay him by advance whatever he demanded for our passage, and for the conveniences he had helped us to. The mate told him that the captain would be on board in the afternoon, and that he would leave all that till he came. Accordingly, in the afternoon the captain came, and we found him the same courteous, obliging man that the boatswain had represented him to be, and he was so well pleased with my husband's conversation that, in short, he would not let us keep the cabin we had chosen, but gave us one that, as I said before, opened into the great cabin. Nor were his conditions exorbitant, or the man craving and eager to make a prey of us, but for 15 guineas we had our whole passage and provisions and cabin, ate at the captain's table, and were very handsomely entertained. The captain lay himself in the other part of the great cabin, having let his round house, as they call it, to a rich planter who went over with his wife and 3 children, who ate by themselves. He had some other ordinary passengers who quartered in the steerage, and as for our old fraternity, they were kept under the hatches while the ship lay there, and came very little on the deck. I could not refrain acquainting my governess with what had happened. It was but just that she, who was so really concerned for me, should have part in my good fortune. Besides, I wanted her assistance to supply me with several necessaries, which before I was shy of letting anybody see me have, that it might not be public. But now I had a cabin and room to set things in, I ordered abundance of good things for our comfort in the voyage, as brandy, sugar, lemons, etc., to make punch, and treat our benefactor the captain, an abundance of things for eating and drinking in the voyage, also a larger bed and bedding proportioned to it, so that, in a word, we resolved to want for nothing in the voyage. All this while I had provided nothing for our assistance when we should come to the place and begin to call ourselves planters, and I was far from being ignorant of what was needful on that occasion, particularly all sorts of tools for the planter's work, and for building, and all kinds of furniture for our dwelling, which, if to be bought in the country, must necessarily cost double the price. So I discoursed that point with my governess, and she went and waited upon the captain, and told him that she hoped ways might be found out for her 2 unfortunate cousins, as she called us, to obtain our freedom when we came into the country, and so entered into a discourse with him about the means and terms also, of which I shall say more in its place. And after thus sounding the captain, she let him know, though we were unhappy in the circumstances that occasioned our going, yet that we were not unfurnished to set ourselves to work in the country, and we resolved to settle and live there as planters, if we might be put in a way how to do it. The captain readily offered his assistance, told her the method of entering upon such business, and how easy, nay, how certain it was for industrious people to recover their fortunes in such a manner. "Madam," says he, "'tis no reproach to many in that country that have been sent over in worse circumstances than I perceive your cousins are in, provided they do but apply with diligence and good judgment to the business of that place when they come there." She then inquired of him what things it was necessary we should carry over with us, and he, like a very honest as well as knowing man, told her thus: "Madam, your cousins in the first place must procure somebody to buy them as servants, in conformity to the conditions of their transportation, and then, in the name of that person, they may go about what they will. They may either purchase some plantations already begun, or they may purchase land of the government of the country, and begin where they please, and both will be done reasonably." She bespoke his favour in the first article, which he promised to her to take upon himself, and indeed faithfully performed it. And as to the rest, he promised to recommend us to such as should give us the best advice, and not to impose upon us, which was as much as could be desired. She then asked him if it would not be necessary to furnish us with a stock of tools and materials for the business of planting, and he said, yes, by all means. And then she begged his assistance in it. She told him she would furnish us with everything that was convenient, whatever it cost her. He accordingly gave her a long particular of things necessary for a planter, which by his account came to about 80 or 100 pounds. And in short, she went about as dexterously to buy them as if she had been an old Virginia merchant, only that she bought by my direction above twice as much of everything as he had given her a list of. These she put on board in her own name, took his bills of loading for them, and endorsed those bills of loading to my husband, insuring the cargo afterwards in her own name, by our order, so that we were provided for all events and for all disasters. I should have told you that my husband gave her all his whole stock of 108 pounds, which, as I have said, he had about him in gold, to lay out thus, and I gave her a good sum besides, so that I did not break into the stock which I had left in her hands at all, but after we had sorted out our whole cargo, we had yet near 200 pounds in money, which was more than enough for our purpose. In this condition, very cheerful, and indeed joyful at being so happily accommodated as we were, we set sail from Bugby's Hole to Gravesend, where the ship lay about 10 more days, and where the captain came on board for good and all. Here the captain offered us a civility, which indeed we had no reason to expect, namely, to let us go on shore and refresh ourselves, upon giving our words in a solemn manner that we would not go from him, and that we would return peaceably on board again. This was such an evidence of his confidence in us that it overcame my husband, who, in a mere principle of gratitude, told him, as he could not be in any capacity to make a suitable return for such a favour, so he could not think of accepting of it, nor could he be easy that the captain should run such a risk. After some mutual civilities, I gave my husband a purse, in which was 80 guineas, and he put it into the captain's hand. "There, captain," says he, "there's part of a pledge for our fidelity. If we deal dishonestly with you on any account, 'tis your own." And on this we went on shore. Indeed, the captain had assurance enough of our resolutions to go, for that having made such provision to settle there, it did not seem rational that we would choose to remain here at the expense and peril of life, for such it must have been if we had been taken again. In a word, we went all on shore with the captain, and supped together in Gravesend, where we were very merry, stayed all night, lay at the house where we supped, and came all very honestly on board again with him in the morning. Here we bought 10 dozen bottles of good beer, some wine, some fowls, and such things as we thought might be acceptable on board. My governess was with us all this while, and went with us round into the Downs, as did also the captain's wife, with whom she went back. I was never so sorrowful at parting with my own mother as I was at parting with her, and I never saw her more. We had a fair easterly wind spring up the 3rd day after we came to the Downs, and we sailed from thence the 10th of April. Nor did we touch any more at any place, till, being driven on the coast of Ireland by a very hard gale of wind, the ship came to an anchor in a little bay near the mouth of a river, whose name I remember not, but they said the river came down from Limerick, and that it was the largest river in Ireland. Here, being detained by bad weather for some time, the captain, who continued the same kind, good-humoured man as at first, took us two on shore with him again. He did it now in kindness to my husband, indeed, who bore the sea very ill, and was very sick, especially when it blew so hard. Here we brought in again a store of fresh provisions, especially beef, pork, mutton, and fowls, and the captain stayed to pickle up 5 or 6 barrels of beef to lengthen out the ship's store. We were here not above 5 days, when the weather turning mild and a fair wind, we set sail again, and in 42 days came safe to the coast of Virginia. When we drew near to the shore, the captain called me to him, and told me that he found by my discourse I had some relations in the place, and that I had been there before, and so he supposed I understood the custom of their disposing the convict prisoners when they arrived. I told him I did not, and that as to what relations I had in the place, he might be sure I would make myself known to none of them while I was in the circumstances of a prisoner, and that as to the rest, we left ourselves entirely to him to assist us, as he was pleased to promise us he would do. He told me I must get somebody in the place to come and buy us as servants, and who must answer for us to the governor of the country if he demanded us. I told him we should do as he should direct, so he brought a planter to treat with him, as it were, for the purchase of these 2 servants, my husband and me, and there we were formally sold to him, and went ashore with him. The captain went with us, and carried us to a certain house. Whether it was to be called a tavern or not, I know not, but we had a bowl of punch there, made of rum, etc., and were very merry. After some time the planter gave us a certificate of discharge, and an acknowledgment of having served him faithfully, and we were free from him the next morning, to go whither we would. For this piece of service the captain demanded of us 6,000 weight of tobacco, which he said he was accountable for to his freighter, and which we immediately bought for him, and made him a present of 20 guineas besides, with which he was abundantly satisfied. It is not proper to enter here into the particulars of what part of the colony of Virginia we settled in, for divers reasons. It may suffice to mention that we went into the great river Potomac, the ship being bound thither, and there we intended to have settled first, though afterwards we altered our minds. The first thing I did of moment, after having gotten all our goods on shore and placed them in a storehouse or warehouse, which with a lodging we hired at the small place or village where we landed. I say the first thing was to inquire after my mother and after my brother, that fatal person whom I married as a husband, as I have related at large. A little inquiry furnished me with information that Mrs. —, that is, my mother, was dead, that my brother, or husband, was alive, which I confessed I was not very glad to hear, but which was worse, I found he was removed from the plantation where he lived formerly, and where I lived with him, and lived with one of his sons in a plantation just by the place where we landed, and where we had hired a warehouse. I was a little surprised at first, but as I ventured to satisfy myself that he could not know me, I was not only perfectly easy, but had a great mind to see him, if it was possible to do so without his seeing me. In order to that, I found out by inquiry the plantation where he lived, and with a woman of that place whom I got to help me, like what we call a chairwoman, I rambled about towards the place as if I had only a mind to see the country and look about me. At last I came so near that I saw the dwelling-house. I asked the woman whose plantation that was. She said it belonged to such a man, and looking out a little to our right hands, "There," says she, "is the gentleman that owns the plantation, and his father with him." "What are their Christian names?" said I. "I know not," says she, "what the old gentleman's name is, but the son's name is Humphrey, and I believe," says she, "the father's is too." You may guess, if you can, what a confused mixture of joy and fright possessed my thoughts upon this occasion, for I immediately knew that this was nobody else but my own son, by that father she showed me, who was my own brother. I had no mask, but I ruffled my hood so about my face that I depended upon it that above 20 years' absence, and withal not expecting anything of me in that part of the world, he would not be able to know anything of me. But I need not have used all that caution, for the old gentleman was grown dim-sighted by some distemper which had fallen upon his eyes, and could but just see well enough to walk about, and not run against a tree or into a ditch. The woman that was with me had told me that by a mere accident, knowing nothing of what importance it was to me. As they drew near to us, I said, "Does he know you, Mrs. Owen?" So they called the woman. "Yes," said she, "if he hears me speak he will know me, but he can't see well enough to know me or anybody else." And so she told me the story of his sight as I have related. This made me secure, and so I threw open my hoods again and let them pass by me. It was a wretched thing for a mother thus to see her own son, a handsome, comely young gentleman in flourishing circumstances, and durst not make herself known to him, and durst not take any notice of him. Let any mother of children that reads this consider it, and but think with what anguish of mind I restrained myself, what yearnings of soul I had in me to embrace him and weep over him, and how I thought all my entrails turned within me, that my very bowels moved, and I knew not what to do, as I now know not how to express those agonies. When he went from me, I stood gazing and trembling, and looking after him as long as I could see him. Then, sitting down to rest me, but turned from her, and lying on my face, wept and kissed the ground that he had set his foot on. I could not conceal my disorder so much from the woman that but she perceived it, and thought I was not well, which I was obliged to pretend was true, upon which she pressed me to rise, the ground being damp and dangerous, which I did accordingly, and walked away. As I was going back again, and still talking of this gentleman and his son, a new occasion of melancholy offered itself thus. The woman began as if she would tell me a story to divert me. "There goes," says she, "a very odd tale among the neighbours where this gentleman formerly lived." "What was that?" said I. "Why," says she, "that the old gentleman going to England when he was a young man fell in love with a young lady there, one of the finest women that ever was seen, and married her, and brought her over hither to his mother, who was then living. He lived here several years with her," continued she, "and had several children by her, of which the young gentleman that was with him now was one. But after some time the old gentlewoman, his mother, talking to her of something relating to herself when she was in England, and of her circumstances in England, which were bad enough, the daughter-in-law began to be very much surprised and uneasy, and in short, examining further into things, it appeared past all contradiction that the old gentlewoman was her own mother, and that consequently that the son was his wife's own brother, which struck the whole family with horror and put them into such a confusion that it had almost ruined them all. The young woman would not live with him. The son, her brother, and husband for a time went distracted, and at last the young woman went away for England, and has never been heard of since. It is easy to believe that I was strangely affected with this story, but 'tis impossible to describe the nature of my disturbance. I seemed astonished at the story, and asked her 1,000 questions about the particulars, which I found she was thoroughly acquainted with. At last I began to inquire into the circumstances of the family, how the old gentlewoman, I mean my mother, died, and how she left what she had, for my mother had promised me very solemnly that when she died she would do something for me, and leave it so as that, if I was living, I should, one way or other, come at it, without its being in the power of her son, my brother and husband, to prevent it. She told me she did not know exactly how it was ordered, but she had been told that my mother had left a sum of money, and had tied a plantation for the payment of it, to be made good to the daughter if ever she could be heard of, either in England or elsewhere, and that the trust was left with this son, who was the person that we saw with his father. This was news too good for me to make light of, and you may be sure filled my heart with 1,000 thoughts, what course I should take, how and when, and in what manner I should make myself known, or whether I should ever make myself know or know.